Okay, next is another relatively short chapter, the last one, on the Pacific and Polar Realm, which is essentially the area of the Pacific Ocean that we haven't covered yet. So these are the few terms, concepts, ideas, and terms. Make sure you know them. And we just got through covering the Austral realm, which is Australia and New Zealand. And the rest of the Pacific is called the Pacific realm. And also they're including the polar regions like Antarctica in this chapter as well. Now the one big island is this one here, Papua New Guinea. That New Guinea island, part of it is in Indonesia, but this eastern part is an independent country called Papua New Guinea. And it's the only kind of big one. And other than that, there's islands of various size, including places like Hawaii, out into the Pacific. And just a little food for thought, that we look at, you know, geographic factors and their implications, and we want to look at what are some of the unique factors about island environments, like situation, relative location, that type of thing, and just really a quick comparison. This is Singapore Island that we discussed in Southeast Asia. It has a population of over 5 million packed on this tiny island, and a per person average income higher than the United States, $80,000 per year. Whereas Tonga, out here, this group of islands, it's a comparable size island environment, but has a much lower population, only about 100,000 people, and a average income that's about 10% of the United States. And one thing to think about is how difficult its relative location is here compared to Singapore. Singapore has an absolutely great relative location along what's called the Malacca Strait, an area that is right along shipping lanes, the most important shipping lanes of the world. Whereas Tonga here is very isolated. It's way out in the Pacific Ocean and way out of the way from from trade and other types of traffic. All right, so what we're really talking about is isolated islands, and I think it might be helpful to talk about different kinds of islands. That when we say islands, these are areas that are surrounded by water, but you really have two different kinds. You have continental islands. We mentioned before that the continental shelf, that continents don't magically end at the water's edge. They continue underneath the water, and in some places where there's higher ground, these are simply pieces of the continent that are out of the water, and we call this a continental island. So sometimes, earthquakes or other tectonic activity can, cause, part of the land to be a little bit uplifted and out of the water. Whereas oceanic islands are truly isolated in the ocean, that these are places where volcanic activity has created brand new land in the ocean that is truly isolated from a continent. So here, this is showing Southeast Asia and Australia and New Guinea prior to the modern, so in the ice ages when sea levels were a lot lower, these were actually connected to each other. So Australia and New Guinea, including Papua New Guinea, are really continental islands. That New Guinea, including Papua New Guinea, is part of the continent of Australia. Likewise, a lot of Southeast Asia is really part of the Asian continent, but separated as sea levels have risen. That in the past, these were all one part of a landmass called Sunda, and in Australia, these were connected as a landmass called Sahul. So these are two examples of continental islands. Let me show another example. If you look at the United Kingdom here, the British Isles, and if you can see this sort of lighter color on the map, this is actually the continental shelf of Europe, that the European continent extends underneath the water quite a ways, and the United Kingdom and Ireland are actually pieces of the European continent that are separated by higher sea levels. And again, let this refresh here. So is parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Australia and Guinea Island here. But as we make our way out into the Pacific, you have these truly isolated oceanic islands that are not physically part of a continent. They're disattached from any sort of continent, and they exist by themselves out here. All right, so we have continental islands like the British Isles, and we also have oceanic islands. And these are caused by volcanic activity from deep in the ocean floor. And these are fundamentally different than continents, that the oceans are made of a different kind of a rock than continents are, where continents are made of things like granite, like you would find in Yosemite. These islands are made of a darker oceanic type of rock called basalt. And that's why in places like Hawaii, you have these dark rocks, because these are created through a different kind of geologic activity. And in some places, you also have what are called atolls or coral reefs that grow up around an old volcano. And I think that needs a little more explanation. So let's show some pictures of some things. So where you have volcanic activity, you can create an island. And then a secondary thing that can happen is that you can have the development of a coral reef around an island. Now, over time, these islands will get eroded away. But as they erode away, the coral reefs can remain, and these coral reefs are called atolls. Now, one thing about coral reefs is that they're resistant to wave erosion. So the waves that come in and lap at these islands over time that wear them away, the coral is more resistant to that. So you can have islands that disappear because of erosion, but coral reefs that remain for a longer period of time. One thing about coral reefs is they're not created by geology, they're created by biology. They're actually accumulations of skeletons of sea creatures that accumulate over time, but requires special conditions to develop. I'll leave this in the slides, but won't go over it in detail, but the specialty conditions are certain temperatures of water, especially, so oftentimes you find coral reefs in the tropical regions near the equator. So this is showing where you have coral reefs in the world. Now, Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, when he was out sailing around and looking at different islands trying to collect specimens to develop his evolutionary theories, also noticed that there seemed to be an evolution of islands, that these are different islands in different places. And he saw these examples of different sort of life stages of islands, that you had brand new islands that were created by volcanic activity with no reef. Then over time, a reef would develop around these volcanic islands. And then as time passed, the volcanic part would start to erode, but the reefs would remain until finally, this is what an atoll is. It's simply a reef that's remained once an island is eroded away. So the idea is you start with a volcanic island and a fringing reef around it. And as this kind of shows in 3D, as the island itself starts to erode away, you end up with what's called a barrier reef, because it's kind of the island is shrinking away from the reef. And then lastly, you have an atoll, sort of the last remnant of the island that is resistant to wave erosion. So here's what an atoll looks like. This is a sort of a barrier reef around an island. And this is one where you have a reef and the volcanic part is, just a bit of it is left. Now, this is showing the development of Hawaii. So one thing to note is that where you have the lava coming out and creating the islands, a second thing is happening as well, that with plate tectonics, some of the plates will move in a particular direction, and this is the direction that the Pacific plate is moving in. So what happens is that an island gets created, but then it moves away from the volcanic activity down the line. So if we look about 2.5 million years ago, the island of Oahu, which is now there today, was where what was being created. But over time, it then moved off of the volcano, and this part was created. And this became the islands of, for example, of Maui and a couple of others. And then it moved off the hotspot. And currently, we have the big island of Hawaii that is being created. Meanwhile, these older islands, which have moved away from the volcano, are starting to erode over time. So this is what's happening on the big island. It's being created. A reef may start to develop. But as you move away from the volcano, you get to where you have an atoll. So that's a long way of explaining why we have different types of islands. And we can really divide these into two types. We have high islands. These have remaining agriculture, remaining volcanic peaks. Then we have low islands, which are really simply atolls for the most part. So first off, high islands are made of volcanic rock. And as we mentioned in Southeast Asia, volcanic rock is highly productive for agriculture. So in high islands, agriculture is the primary economic activity, not counting tourism, but the primary way of making a living for producing food. Whereas in low islands, the coral is not productive farmland. And so in low islands, people are more dependent on fishing. That fishing is the primary economic activity in low islands. So here's an example of a high island. You can see the volcanic part in the background. Here's another in Tahiti. You can see the volcanic peak. You can see the reef developing around it. And this is a low island, no volcanic peak. We've mentioned maritime claims, and the EEZs are exclusive economic zones, and these are very important for island countries because the exclusive economic zone of 200 miles can be quite large compared with the small island. That you may have a tiny island with a fairly large exclusive economic zone for fishing around it. Just skip ahead a little bit. And we've talked about the maritime boundaries in the past, so I'm going to skip over that. And we'll continue this in a bit.